time has come for our generation to lead the way towards a new American century. We must change the decisions we are making by changing the people who are making them. But this election is not just about what laws we're going to pass. This election is a generational choice about what kind of country we will be.
Senator Marco Rubio front and center late yesterday, throwing his hat in the ring for the Oval Office in 2016. Welcome to America's Forum, front and center right now with Miranda Kahn. I'm J.D. Hayworth. It is so good to have you with us on this Tuesday morning. And Miranda, Senator Rubio was clear in defining himself as a leader for today's challenges.
Yeah, and in doing so, he said that this election is, quote, a generational choice, and went as far as to say another candidate who just announced this weekend was, quote, a leader from yesterday.
Now, he did not mention Hillary Clinton by name, but it was clear to whom he was referring. Right. So how will Rubio's candidacy impact the presidential race in 2016? With more on this story, we're very pleased to be joined by political commentator Pat Buchanan. Pat's a former senior advisor to both President Richard Nixon and President Ronald Reagan. He's also the author of the book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. And we're likewise joined by our good friend, Newsmax contributor Larry Elder, who checks in from Newsmax, L.A. Pat, let's get into this. Marco Rubio makes it official. How do you assess his chances?
Well, I think his rollout was just excellent. It was in contrast with Hillary Clinton's on Sunday, which I think did not succeed, that low-keyed rollout. And Marco Rubio, what he's doing, folks have said it reminds them of how Barack Obama did it in 2007, 2008. I go back a longer way. He reminds me a bit, they seem to be almost channeling John F. Kennedy. You know, a new generation of Americans. It's time for this World War II generation to take over from the older generation of Dwight Eisenhower, and talking about the future and the new generation, the new ideas, and they are yesterday and we are tomorrow. I think it's conscious. I think he becomes really a second tier, first at least a second tier candidate in the Republican run.
Pat, as somebody who's not all that much younger than Hillary, I find it a little disturbing, this generational stuff. Ronald Reagan was older than Hillary would be if she were to win, and Ronald Reagan was a terrific president. Don't you find it a little bit off-putting, this business about young versus old?
Well, I think it's you make an excellent point, and Ronald Reagan was a great president. He was the oldest man, I think, ever to serve by far. The second oldest had been James Buchanan. But I think you are right about some of the risk that is taken by Rubio when he argues this way. But at the same time, it does have clear advantages and attractions to a lot of younger people who say, look, Hillary, we don't want Hillary, and we also don't want Jeb. He belongs to the Bushes. They did a good job, or we didn't do a good job. So that you are saying, Larry, correctly, that it entails a measure of risk, and I agree with you. But I think on balance, it's probably a positive approach for Rubio.
And what does this mean for Jeb Bush? Because that's another name that comes up from the past.
Well, that's the real problem for Rubio. How well does he do in terms of fundraising? I'm sure the same people contributed to him as contributed to Bush. Bush is going to have a great deal more money. I think Bush people see this as something of a betrayal. They could be very, very tough on Marco Rubio. One of his disadvantages, I think, is he does seem, I mentioned Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy in 1960 had been, he was a war hero in World War II. He had been in Congress for 6 years and the Senate for 8 years. And he was the same age as Rubio, but he had a sense of maturity. But even then, people were wondering about, is he old enough, mature enough, really to handle the presidency? And I think that's going to come up with Marco Rubio, because in terms of appearance, there is something about him that says that doesn't say president.
Well, I don't know in terms of appearance if the word president can be associated with the Democrat frontrunner. Kind of curious yesterday, Pat, as Hillary Clinton was caught on a security camera at a Chipotle restaurant in Ohio nobody behind the counter recognized her when she was there. Is that effective use of sunglasses, or could that be an ominous harbinger for the former First Lady? 30 seconds.
That Chipotle is frequented all by Buchanan brigaders, and they wouldn't recognize her, J.D.
But you have to admit that was curious.
It is an amazing fact.
But does that say more about kids working at a fast food place? They don't keep up with current events? Yeah. Well, listen, there's a lot more we need to talk with you about this. You mentioned Rubio as JFK. What about the specter of Hillary as Nixon? And what about rescuing and winning items near and dear to cultural conservatives as the culture war continues? There's lots more to talk about with Pat Buchanan. We will get to all of it as America's Forum continues here on Newsmax TV. Stay with us. With Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth back with you on America's Forum. Time to continue our conversation with former presidential advisor and political commentator Pat Buchanan. Also with us from Newsmax LA, our good friend and Newsmax contributor Larry Elder. So Patrick J., you were talking about Marco Rubio and JFK, yet you've gone on the record saying that Hillary Clinton reminds you of another president for whom you worked. Who is that again, and why?
I finished a book a year ago, J.D. I'm sure we talked about it on The Greatest Comeback, on how Richard Nixon basically rebranded himself after that defeat by JFK in 1960, and how he came back and maneuvered through the great cultural, social, moral, civil rights revolution of the 1960s to arrive at the end of the decade raising his hand as President of the United States. Hillary does remind me, what came back to me was the whole idea that of these emails, and I remember I told Nixon, when the news came out, I said, burn the tapes, get rid of all these tapes, there's a lot of stuff on there that nobody knows was made and should never have been made. And you saw her with her emails, and where are they now, J.D.?
Yeah, where are
They're
they?
all gone. Can't retrieve them.
Yeah, well,
try to find the server.
Yeah, that whole electronic thing, not a gap, just missing emails. With that intriguing story still out there, let's move to the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. You talked about the Nixon formula for victory. Today, we have a president, I won't say he's hostile to Christians, but he does seem to take exception to some Christians. Let's listen to what he had to say at a prayer breakfast at the White House during the Easter season.
Easter is a day of hope and a season of hope. It's a reaffirmation of our belief, not just as Christians, but as Americans, that better days are always ahead of us. Whether we're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, or Buddhist, whether faith in God shapes our daily lives completely or not at all, we believe that with common effort and shared sacrifice, a brighter future is just around the bend. And we embrace our obligation to do something meaningful, something lasting, with the precious time we've been allotted on this earth.
That, of course, the official statement. Now, at a prayer breakfast, he said, I suppose as a Christian, I'm supposed to love, but I say I have that less than loving expressions toward some Christians. We apologize for not having that audio. Pat, I think you saw it. My question is this. Has the president decided just to try and roll over cultural conservatives and conservatives in the Christian tradition?
J.D., the President of the United States doesn't have to run again, and he feels very much liberated. And he's going to say what he believes, and he's going to do what he wants in foreign policy, and that's what I believe he's doing. But on the Christian era, what we have seen since the 1960s, that decade, is really the de-Christianization of America in the public sphere. If you take a look at what happened, abortion used to be a crime. It's a constitutional right. Homosexual relations were outlawed in every state. Now they're a constitutional right. Same-sex marriage is overwhelmingly approved of by young people in this country. I remember the movies used to be, we're A-rated and B-rated and C-rated. Now, pornography is rampant on the internet. I think what we've seen is really the de-Christianization of America and the redefining of Christianity to mean something it didn't mean in the 1950s. And there's no doubt that Barack Obama is the avatar politically of this change.
Pat, Dick Cheney, before Obama evolved on the issue of gay marriage, came out and said that gay marriage should be a matter determined state by state. Do you think that that was a retreat from his Christian values?
No, I don't. I mean, I agree that abortion, for example, which I think is immoral and wrong, and it's the taking of an innocent human life, but I do believe it's a decision that ought to be taken state by state, as it was back in the 19s. For example, before Roe v. Wade in '73, California under Reagan, before he became militantly pro-life, passed one of the most unrestrictive laws on abortion in the country, as did Nelson Rockefeller in New York. I do believe that the political decisions are best made state by state, whether they agree with my beliefs or not, but I don't think that's inconsistent with my statement that America has been, when you look back at the country I grew up in, just de-Christianized to an extraordinary extent in its public life.
Pat, I have to ask you, you described the president as being kind of an avatar. Some would argue that he may just be representing what has become popular in our culture.
Well, I think if you say he is not a leader, you're dead right. He has said himself, I think, I believed this for a long time before he came out and said it. In other words, he waited until the polls turned in order to state his convictions. I think that's fair, and to say that he really did not lead this, but he is rolling right along with it. I probably should have used a better example that he's an exemplar of the trends that have taken place in the culture.
Fair enough, and we will have to leave it there. Patrick J. Buchanan, author of the book The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. We thank Pat Buchanan. We'll have Larry Elder back a little later in our program. You stay with us.